hours of service regulations. I'm sure you're aware the hours of service regulations have been around for a long time. As a matter of fact, they were originally issued in 1938. And from 1938 to 2004, there were relatively few changes to the hours of service. But in 2004, FMCSA started making changes. And since that time, numerous changes have been proposed. It's your responsibility as a professional truck driver to be compliant with these changes. The hours of service regulations have been around for years, and they really haven't changed a lot over that time. So it's surprising that there are so many people that are confused about the rules and regulations. The thing you need to remember is the hours of service regulations deal in 4 areas that determine the maximum amount of time that you're allowed to drive. First, the number of hours that you drive in a day. Then, the number of hours that you work or you're on duty in a day. Third, the number of hours you can drive based on the number of hours you've been on duty during the past 7 or 8 days. The hours of service regulations also take into consideration the number of hours that you are off duty. And you've got to take into account all 4 of these areas to determine how many hours you're allowed to drive in any given period. So let's take a look at the 3rd area listed above. We're going to be talking about the 60-hour 7-day rule and the 70-hour 8-day rule. The type of operation that you have determines which of these 2 rules applies to you. Let's take a look at some of the facts about the 60 or 70-hour rule. First off, it's not based on a set week. It's not based on a calendar week. It is based on a rolling or floating 7 or 8 day period. For example, if you're operating on a 70-hour 8-day schedule, which most drivers do, the current day would be the newest day of your 8-day period, and the hours you worked 9 days ago would drop out of the calculation. We've been talking about the 60-hour 7-day rule and the 70-hour 8-day rule as if they're the same rule. Actually, they're 2 different rules, and the type of operation you're involved in, that's what determines which one applies to you. FMCSA says if your company or your operation does not operate vehicles every day of the week, you're not allowed to drive after you've been on duty for 60 hours during any 7 consecutive days. Now, what they're saying is if you don't normally operate vehicles every day of the week, that doesn't mean that maybe you just couldn't find a load on Tuesday. What it means is if your schedule does not operate every day of the week, then the 60-hour 7-day rule applies to you. But if you're like most drivers and you operate every day of the week, then the 70-hour 8-day schedule applies to you. And what that means is you're not allowed to drive after you've been on duty 70 hours in any 8 consecutive days. Once you reach that 70-hour on-duty status in any 8 consecutive day period, you can't drive again until you drop below that 70-hour on-duty limit. You can do other work, but you can't do any driving until you get below that limit. Basically, what FMCSA is saying is that they feel that anybody who has been on duty for 60 hours in a 7-day period or more than 70 hours in an 8-day period is just too fatigued to drive safely. It doesn't matter how you feel physically or how you feel about this regulation. This is the rule that we have in place, and FMCSA takes it seriously. I also want to make a note here. This rule takes precedence over the 11-hour driving limit. Once you reach the 60-hour or 70-hour limit, you're done driving, period. It doesn't matter how many hours you have left on your 11-hour limit. Now, let's take a look at some examples so you can better understand how these rules work. Because most drivers operate under the 70-hour 8-day rule, that's the one that we're going to use for our examples. Just keep in mind, if the 60-hour 7-day rule applies to you, you figure it in the exact same way. Keeping a recap chart is probably the easiest way for you to keep track of how many hours you've got in any 8-day period. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. It doesn't need to be anything printed. It could be a scrap piece of paper. It could be a spiral binder. But what you need is a chart where you can keep track of how many hours you've driven, how many hours you spent on duty non-driving, and of course what your total on-duty hours per day is. Now, I know you've got a logbook to keep track of your daily activities, but if you want to stay compliant with the 70-hour, 8-day portion of the hours of service regulations, you need to have a place where you can keep track of your total on-duty hours in any 8 consecutive day period. All right, let's take a look at how a driver would use the recap chart. At the top, you can see our logbook grid, and at the bottom, you can see our recap chart. And remember, we're going to be looking at an 8 consecutive day period as it applies to the 70-hour, 8-day rule. Our driver's just completing his 34-hour restart on Sunday at midnight, and so he is off duty for 24 hours. Since our driver logged 0 hours on duty, he still has 70 hours available in this 8-day period.